Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world that's as alluring as it is haunting. The secretive, carefully constructed lives of Japanese courtesans during the Edo period. These women weren't just performers or entertainers, they were artists, cultural icons, and survivors, navigating a life painted in silk and shadow. But beneath the layers of elegance and grace was a reality far more brutal, especially when the body refused to play by the rules. Because in a society where beauty was business and illusion was everything, there was one thing that could shatter the fantasy instantly: pregnancy. Imagine the weight of 12 layers of silk wrapped so tightly around your body you could barely breathe. Your hair sculpted into elaborate shapes, held together with pins sharp and numerous enough to rival a weapon. Your feet balancing on towering wooden shoes, a single misstep away from disaster. This was not fashion. It was a costume for survival. Welcome to Yoshiwara, the glittering district of Old Edo, where dreams were sold by the hour and reality stayed locked behind painted smiles. Yoshiwara was more than a red light district. It was a performance. Lanterns cast golden halos on cobbled streets. Incense curled into the night like ghosts. Courtesans strolled slowly in a practiced dance of allure, every step rehearsed, every smile deliberate. To the outside world, they were art in motion, reciting poetry, strumming the shamisen, offering conversation so charming it masked the transactional nature of their existence. But behind the paper screens and embroidered fans, their lives bore more resemblance to prisoners than princesses. Many of these girls hadn't chosen the path they walked. They were sold, often by their own families, for food, for debt, or simply because mouths were too many and options too few. They arrived young, wide-eyed, and unaware that what awaited them was a life carved out of obligation and debt. Trained as fiercely as opera singers and as rigorously as warriors, they mastered arts of conversation, seduction, music, and poise. But no matter how skilled or how adored, they remained property, belonging not to themselves, but to the brothel, the okiya, and above all, the economy they fueled. They were investments, and like any prized commodity, they were expected to remain flawless and functional. And what, in this tightly wound machine, was the worst thing that could happen to such a product? A child, a pregnancy, a biological betrayal that turned the courtesan from a living artwork into an inconvenient liability. There were no gentle retreats or prenatal retreats in Yoshiwara. No baby showers with delicate sweets and laughter. This was a world where a pregnant courtesan might vanish behind a screen and return only as a cautionary whisper. Because for every brothel owner, the math was simple. A pregnant courtesan was not a romantic partner, not a performer, not a fantasy. She was a problem. She couldn't dance, couldn't drink with clients, couldn't flirt convincingly when her own body refused to obey. And so, the rules were written in ink and fear. If a courtesan showed signs of pregnancy, or even whispered the word, her entire world could come undone. Punishments varied. Some were hidden, demoted, or sent to serve the roughest clients. Others were locked away with chilling instructions to take care of the issue. And if they couldn't, if they carried the child to term, they risked not just their career, but their very survival. But here's the thing. Getting pregnant wasn't always the result of some grand affair or reckless romance. More often than not, it was simply biology catching up with a life of performance and obligation. Clients came and went, many of them drunken, some violent, most forgettable. They paid for illusion, not responsibility. If consequences followed, the man disappeared, and the courtesan was left alone to handle the fallout. And so she did, quietly, desperately, in ways that history barely records and humanity rarely remembers. Herbal brews that scorched the throat and tore the body from the inside out. Rituals whispered behind locked doors. Hot baths so searing they burned skin, not just secrets. Courtesans became masters of deception, not just of the heart, but of the womb. They bound their bellies, altered their gaits, lied with practiced ease, all to protect the one thing Yoshiwara truly demanded, the illusion of perfection. It wasn't vanity, it was survival. The body, however, has its own rhythms, and no amount of silk or silence could always hide what was growing beneath. So began the war behind the walls. A battle not waged with swords or scandal, but with bitter teas, boiling water, and trembling hands. When a courtesan suspected the truth, she didn't speak it. She watched, waited, and listened for the cues in her own body. A missed cycle? Blame the weather. Morning sickness? Say it was spoiled fish. Every symptom became a puzzle to explain away. Every symptom a warning bell only she could hear. There was no one to confide in, no doctors, no sisters, no confidants. Only the other women, older perhaps, who had once walked the same tightrope and survived. Remedies passed in whispers, 3 leaves of one herb, not 5. 5 is for headaches. 3 is for something else entirely. These weren't cures, they were gambles. The teas were mixtures of mugwort, safflower, and other roots with poetic names and terrifying effects. Not taken in sips, but in gulps, with a prayer on the tongue and a scream trapped behind the teeth. They worked, sometimes. Other times, they brought only blood, fever, and silence. And still the courtesan had to smile, had to serve tea, pour sake, laugh at jokes, flirt with men whose touch had caused the crisis in the first place. The performance never ended. Even when her body was failing, even when her insides were twisting with pain and panic, the curtain never dropped. That was the rule. If you bled in silence. But if the tea failed, and many times it did, there were darker roads to walk. The old women came next, not midwives in the comforting sense, but shadow dwellers, known only by word of mouth and stories spoken in fear. They were called basan, a term that meant old woman, but in these corners of the world it meant much more. They were ghosts in human form, former courtesans themselves, discarded by time and beauty, who now dealt in the business of undoing. No clinics, no names, no promises. Just candlelight, blood, and hope. You didn't go to them, you found them. A folded note in a sleeve, a glance exchanged, a night spent wandering until you reached the right door. The tools they used were never clean, never precise. Boiling water, rags, whatever could be found. No anesthesia, no healing, only pain with a price tag. Some paid in coins, some in heirlooms, some in whatever was left of their youth. And many never came back. Those who did? They returned not to sympathy, but to suspicion. If a courtesan disappeared for too long, the brothel noticed. If she walked differently, spoke more softly, ate less, the questions came. Or worse, no questions at all, just fewer clients, colder glances, and the slow disintegration of everything she had spent years building. But the fear wasn't only of punishment, it was of erasure. Because once the brothel decided a woman was no longer an asset, they erased her not with fire or fury, but with silence. They said she went to visit family. They said she was sick. They never said pregnant. That word could burn a house down. So some tried one last method, the boiling bath. A ritual not of comfort, but of desperation. The water was drawn scalding hot, the steam thick as guilt. A woman stepped in not to relax, but to purge. It was believed that if the body was shocked hard enough, the problem might vanish. Stay in until you faint, they said. If you black out, it's working. This wasn't advice. It was surrender. And many took it, knowing full well they might not rise again. Yet even if the bath failed, even if the herbs failed, even if the midwife's hand shook too much or the blood didn't stop flowing, still the courtesan was expected to return, to paint her face, to bind her belly, to move like everything was normal while her very soul was cracking apart. And so they invented another trick at a tight binding. Long strips of cloth wrapped again and again around the stomach until the body looked unchanged, until the illusion held a little longer. Breathing became difficult. Movement restricted. But that didn't matter. What mattered was looking unchanged, because in Yoshiwara, truth was dangerous. The belly must stay flat, the smile must stay soft, the secret must stay buried. Even if it kicked, but secrets cannot stay hidden forever, not in a world where walls are made of paper and silence only invites closer listening. Sooner or later, the lie began to fray. A missed step, a hand resting too long on the lower abdomen, a moment of fatigue not quite covered by a smile. And that was when the whispers started. Not from strangers, but from within, the other courtesans, the servants, the brothel staff. She's walking slower. She's paler. She's not drinking. She's not bleeding. The brothel, always watching, tightened its grip. She might be reassigned, under the pretense of rest, to a room with fewer windows. She might find her companions replaced by silence. Less work, not out of mercy, but because the owners were preparing her replacement. Or perhaps she would be summoned behind a sliding screen and offered no words at all. Just a look that said, "We know." Some were demoted, sent to serve clients with more complaints than coin. Others were locked away until the issue was resolved, a word that held no comfort. A few were expelled altogether, escorted to the edge of the district with nothing but a bundle of clothes and a tarnished name. In elite brothels, there was more elegance in the cruelty. A polite lie was told. She'd gone to the mountains for reflection. She was visiting family. Everyone smiled and pretended not to know the truth. For the courtesan who still had strength, who still had will, there was one final choice: to vanish, to run. They called them Nijijoro, the runaway women. Not rebels, not criminals, just women who dared to imagine a life beyond the contracts inked in desperation. Running was dangerous. It was illegal. A courtesan was property. Her debts were considered binding, and her body part of the house's inventory. Escaping meant breaking more than a rule. It meant threatening the fantasy on which Yoshiwara was built. And yet they ran. Some left in the dead of night, their elaborate hairstyles undone, makeup wiped clean, faces finally their own. They dressed like commoners, rode in carts beneath laundry, or hid in barrels carried to the markets. There are stories, some true, some whispered into legend, of women who disappeared into the countryside, into mountain shrines or fishing villages, where no one asked about their past, and where the brothel's reach began to blur. Not all made it. Some were found, dragged back and punished publicly. A warning to others. A display that said, illusion is more important than freedom. But some escaped so cleanly that their names turned into myths. One became a nun, they said. Another raised her child among the hills. She tells fortunes now, if you believe the stories. For those who couldn't run, because of sickness, fear, or lack of opportunity, there was only one path left: to deliver the child in secret, not in a bed surrounded by warmth and safety, but in storage rooms, behind curtains, or beneath the open sky. A cloth between the teeth to muffle screams, a servant or older courtesan acting as midwife, their hands practiced, their mouths sealed. A bucket of water, a towel, a whispered prayer. No names, no fanfare. Only a small, warm body wrapped in cloth, hidden until morning. If she was lucky, someone helped her feed it for a day, maybe 2. But everyone knew the child could not stay. The brothel had no place for innocence, and so she would walk, under cover of night, to a place many knew but no one spoke of. A shrine, a stone, a place of abandonment. There she would leave the child with a folded prayer, maybe a charm, maybe nothing at all, and she would walk away, not because she didn't care, but because there was no other choice. Sometimes a monk would find the baby, sometimes a stranger, sometimes no one. The mother would return to the brothel, her face powdered, her lips painted, the echo of her child's cry caught forever in her breath. The next morning, she would serve tea, and no one would speak of it, but even in silence, something lingered. In the floating world of the courtesan, where everything was performance and nothing was allowed to be real, not even a child could fully disappear. The women who gave birth in secret carried their grief like a second skin. They had no graves to visit, no names to whisper, and yet they remembered. They always remembered. There were places in Japan where this memory became ritual, where the forgotten were honored, if only in hushed gestures. One such tradition was the Mizuko Kuyo, a quiet, spiritual offering for the souls of unborn or lost children. The term Mizuko, meaning water child, spoke to a life that never fully took shape, never fully belonged to the world of the living. And the courtesans, more than most, knew that in-between space all too well. They lived on the edge of reality, admired but unseen, touched but not known. It was only natural that their children too would exist in the margins. Not ghosts in the haunted sense, but spirits caught in the current, drifting. The women who had lost them, by force, by fear, by no fault of their own, did what little they could. They visited quiet temples, not as mothers, but as mourners in disguise. They brought offerings, baby toys, coins, tiny red bibs tied around statues of Jizo, the Buddhist guardian of children and travelers. Some whispered prayers as they lit incense, hands trembling with memories they could not speak aloud. "I'm sorry," they would say, again and again. Not because they lacked love, but because the world had given them no room to show it, and the tragedy was not just that these children were lost. It was that no one else seemed to see them. The temples were hidden, the rituals unspoken. These were acts of secret motherhood, the only kind Yoshiwara allowed. Even then, not all courtesans could perform the Mizuko Kuyo. Some feared being seen. Others had no time, no means, or had been cast out so completely that they couldn't even return to the city of their pain. For those women, the sorrow remained unexorcised, humming beneath their skin like a song no one else could hear. They carried it into every client meeting, every performance, every night they painted their lips and bowed their heads, pretending once more to be something they were not. But it was there, in the slight hesitation before a smile, in the way they held a cup of tea just a little too long, and in that silence they spoke volumes. Yoshiwara itself conspired to keep this silence intact. It was a world built on fantasy, and nothing destroyed fantasy faster than reality. And pregnancy? That was the ultimate betrayal. A client didn't want to be reminded that the woman pouring his sac could bleed, could suffer, could bring life into the world. He wanted a mirror, a dream, a perfect surface that reflected only what he paid to see. So the women learned to protect the illusion, even when it cost them everything, their bodies, their children, their futures. They endured not because they were weak, but because there was no other option. And even when they were punished, even when they were forgotten, they still found ways to resist, not with rage or revolt, but with survival. A coded recipe passed in a whisper, a glance that warned another to stay quiet, a prayer spoken in secret. These were not acts of surrender, they were acts of defiance, because in a world where nothing belonged to them, not their names, not their time, not even their bodies, the only thing they could claim was the right to remember, and so they did. In Yoshiwara, silence wasn't simply the absence of sound. It was strategy. It was protection. It was survival wrapped in brocade and rouge. The district itself thrived on noise, laughter spilling from tea houses, footsteps clicking across wooden floors, drunken singing echoing through narrow alleys. Yet at the heart of it all, there was a silence so dense, so carefully maintained, it felt like part of the architecture. It was the silence around pregnancy. No one spoke of it, but everyone knew. It hung in the air like incense, heavy and bittersweet. Every courtesan understood the rule, not because it was written down, but because it was etched into every consequence she'd ever witnessed. You could be sold, trained, displayed, admired, even loved, but you could not, under any circumstance, show the world what happened when a body did what it was designed to do. So they lived inside the contradiction. They flirted, they enticed, they invited desire. But the moment desire became consequence, they became the enemy. And yet, despite all that, they continued. They painted their faces. They curled their hair. They whispered poems. They became the dream over and over, even when their reality was unraveling beneath the silk. Strength in Yoshiwara was not loud. It didn't storm through the brothel or raise its voice in protest. It was quiet, deliberate, and astonishingly precise. It was the strength to bleed without a sound, to bind your belly tight enough to hide the truth, to hold a smile when your bones ached with fatigue and your heart was full of ghosts. It was the kind of strength that no one celebrated, because no one wanted to see it. But it was there. These women were often accused of being fragile, delicate things, decorations to be admired and discarded. That was the fantasy, after all. But the truth was something else entirely. They were not fragile like glass, but like porcelain, hard, beautiful, and carved to withstand centuries of pressure. They endured things that would crush others, and they did it in silence. The younger courtesans learned from the older ones not just how to pour tea or apply makeup, but how to endure. They were taught the codes, the signs to watch for, the ways to hide pain, the methods to protect themselves and each other when the brothel refused to. A certain way of folding the obi meant, "I need help." A specific turn of the head, a look, a phrase about the weather, it all carried meaning. This wasn't friendship. It was something deeper, a shared language forged in fire and necessity. When one girl began to walk slower, they noticed. When another missed meals or turned pale, the others adjusted. They brought her food when no one was looking. They passed her remedies. They distracted the madam. They risked everything to protect one another, because in a world where every part of them was owned, trust was the only thing that still belonged to them. No one wrote poems about that kind of bravery. No woodblock prints captured the exact moment a girl tightened her belt one notch too far just to keep her secret for one more day. There were no plays, no stories, no songs about the courtesan who chose to give birth alone, silently, behind a screen. But those women existed. They mattered. They were never meant to be remembered. They were supposed to vanish, to fade like the incense smoke they worked beside every night. But still, they left traces. A hairpin left behind. A bib on a Jiso statue. A whispered warning passed from hand to hand. Their strength, their grief, their hope, it lingered even when they did not. Because in the end, they were not just courtesans. They were mothers who were never allowed to be mothers. Daughters sold before they had a chance to become women, artists who used their own pain as a canvas, and survivors of a world that demanded beauty while punishing the life it created. In the floating world, the courtesan's presence was meant to be fleeting. She was there to be admired, not remembered. Her role was to enchant, to beguile, to vanish when the curtain fell. But for those who dared to step outside that script, who bore a child, who tried to flee, who failed to hide the truth, the punishment wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet erasure. They were written out of the story entirely. Their names were left off the scrolls, their faces vanished from the paintings, and those who remained were expected to pretend they never existed. A girl would disappear, and no one would ask, because to ask was to break the illusion. And the illusion was everything. But despite the silence, Their stories endured in fragments. A red bib tied to a statue, a story told in hushed tones over a cup of bitter tea. A child seen once on the edge of the village, looking just a little too much like someone who no longer worked in the district. They weren't gone. They were hidden, buried beneath layers of performance and denial, but never fully erased. In a place where pregnancy was forbidden, it was also common. And in a place where motherhood was criminalized, it never stopped happening. The courtesans did what they had to do. They bound their bellies, drank their potions, took their boiling baths, whispered to one another in code. They survived by becoming experts at pretending everything was fine, even when their lives were falling apart from the inside out. Sometimes, even after giving birth in secret and returning to the brothel floor, they were forced to abandon the child at one of the roadside shrines known as koya or ubasute sites. These weren't places of comfort. They were shrines built for tragedies society didn't want to witness. Tucked into corners of towns, they were somewhere between temple and grave. The woman would arrive under darkness, her child wrapped tightly in cloth. She would lay the infant down on the cold stone, maybe with a charm, maybe a name scrawled hastily on a piece of paper. And then she would walk away. No witnesses, no ceremony, just silence and the sound of her own footsteps receding into the night. If fortune smiled, someone would find the child, a monk, a servant, a stranger with a kind heart. Sometimes temples took them in. Sometimes they were sent to orphanages. Often, they simply vanished into the folds of history, just like their mothers. But the women didn't leave because they lacked love. They left because there was no other path. The brothel wouldn't allow children. The law offered no protection. And even if she had fled, what could she give a child while hiding from bounty hunters with nothing but a comb and a blood-stained sash? So they made the unthinkable choice. Not out of cruelty, but out of love mangled by desperation. And the shrines, they became haunted. People said you could hear crying there, not from the babies, but from the women who had once stood in those shadows. Their grief etched into the wind like invisible gravestones. Everyone knew what the shrines were for, but no one ever asked who had left the child. Because in Yoshiwara, they already knew. They just pretended not to. Even in death, they lingered. In Japanese belief, an unborn or lost child does not simply vanish. It becomes Mizuko, a water child, a soul caught between two realms, not fully living, not yet gone. In the pleasure quarters, where so many lives began in secret and ended without witness, the air was thick with these unseen spirits. For the courtesans who bore them, who bled for them, who left them behind not out of malice but necessity, the Mizuko were not forgotten. They were felt. Some women said they could feel their presence in dreams, in the chill of an unexpected breeze, in the hush that settled at certain hours of the night. Others carried them in the ache behind their eyes, in the corners of their mouth when they smiled too long. The spirits of the lost were everywhere, in the steam of the bathhouse, in the rustle of silk, in the heartbeat that skipped when a client leaned too close. And the courtesans, already ghosts in their own lives, walked with these water children like shadows stitched to their skin. But they didn't just carry sorrow, they carried responsibility. Because in many traditions, Mizuko could not pass peacefully into the next world unless they were properly mourned. Unacknowledged, they might cause misfortune, sickness, dreams, a sense of unease that never quite left. And so, the women did what they could. In secret, with trembling hands, they performed Mizuko Kuyo, offerings for the unborn. Sometimes it was a quiet ritual at a small temple outside the district. Sometimes it was just a whisper, a lit incense stick, a red cloth tied around the neck of a Jizo statue, the Buddhist guardian of lost children and travelers. These weren't grand ceremonies. There was no choir, no crowd, no public mourning, only solitude and apology. The courtesan knelt, head bowed, and murmured words no one else would hear. I'm sorry. Not because she had failed, but because she had loved, quietly, fiercely, in a world that denied her even that. Some women returned to the shrine year after year. Others came only once, unable to bear the reopening of the wound. But all of them remembered, even those who had gone on to serve more clients, to wear finer kimonos, to climb the invisible ladder of the brothel's hierarchy. Beneath the rouge and the laughter, they remembered, because motherhood, even unspoken, even unfinished, leaves a mark that no client, no contract, no night of performance can erase. In the eyes of the world, they were commodities. But in those stolen moments of grief, they were simply human. They couldn't raise their children, but they could pray for them. They couldn't say their names aloud, but they could write them in ash and breath. And for many, it was the only act of motherhood they were ever allowed. The temples that held these offerings, these statues in red bibs and little hats, became sacred ground. Not officially, not in the eyes of the law or the brothel, but to the women who had nothing left but memory, they were altars of love. Proof that something had existed, even if it was now gone. The Mizuko were not just spirits. They were witnesses. They were the quiet proof that love had once been there, even in the darkest corners of Yoshiwara. By day, Yoshiwara shimmered. Lanterns danced in the haze of incense smoke. Music spilled from tea houses. Perfume clung to the air like a whispered promise. The courtesans were radiant, laughing lightly, weaving dreams for those who could pay. But beneath that polished surface was a rule carved in silence. We do not speak of pregnancy. Not ever. It wasn't a policy so much as a pact. Between the brothel and the women. Between the women and themselves. Not because they didn't care, but because they couldn't afford to care where others might see. The illusion was too precious, too profitable. So when a courtesan became pregnant, her world narrowed. Her belly grew, but her life shrank. Every day she woke not just afraid of discovery, but of what would come next. If she couldn't hide, if she couldn't fix it, if she couldn't run. She still had to work. Still had to charm, entertain, perform. Even when she was bleeding from herbal concoctions or trembling from a fever brought on by a boiling bath. She smiled through the ache in her abdomen. She whispered poetry while her body turned against her. She played her part, knowing that if anyone noticed the change in her walk, the faint puff of her ankles, the shadow in her eyes, it could all be over. And if the pregnancy continued, if the belly pushed too far against the binding, if the secret outgrew the silence, then she had one final performance to give. A delivery in darkness. No midwife, no warm hand to hold. Just a servant girl or an older courtesan who had seen it before, who knew how to boil water and keep her mouth shut. The child would come in a storage room or behind a curtain, a towel between the mother's teeth to stifle her cries. No name, no lullaby. Just blood and breath in the quietest hour of the night. The baby might be hidden for a time, fed in secret, rocked in silence. But it was never meant to stay. In Yoshiwara, there was no room for cries in the night, no place for small hands or soft mouths. The courtesan could not become a mother, not openly, not safely. So when the time came, she wrapped the baby in cloth, kissed it once, maybe twice, and walked out into the night. She knew where she was going. The shrines didn't have signs. They didn't need them. Everyone knew where they were. Stone steps, a quiet path, a place built not for worship, but for surrender. There, beneath the moonlight, she left the child. Maybe with a folded prayer, maybe with nothing. And then she turned around. She didn't cry. She couldn't afford to. She returned to the brothel. Washed the blood from her legs. Painted her lips. Smiled. Poured tea. Because the show must go on. There was never time to mourn, Not in Yoshiwara. Not for women whose worth was measured in coin, whose smiles were merchandise, whose hearts were irrelevant so long as they knew how to bow, how to flirt, how to disappear behind a lacquered mask of pleasure. The courtesan who had given birth only hours earlier would be expected to return to her post as if the act of creating life had never happened. She would rise from her bedding, weak and aching, blood still fresh on her thighs, and dress herself in layer after layer of silk that had once symbolized her beauty, but now felt like burial shrouds. Her makeup had to be perfect, her walk steady, no trembling, no faltering. The guests were waiting, and they didn't come to see the truth. They came for the illusion. And so she re-entered the theater of Yoshiwara, not as a mother, but as a product reconditioned. Her body belonged to the house once again. Her sorrow was hers alone. The brothel wouldn't acknowledge the birth. It wouldn't offer care or time or even so much as a change in routine. She had broken the rule. But if she could make herself useful again quickly enough, maybe, just maybe, they would let her stay. And if not, there were always others. In the floating world, women were interchangeable. Today's beloved courtesan was tomorrow's cautionary tale. Her fall from grace would be silent, but swift. No public shaming, no ceremony. Just a sudden absence. Another girl rising to take her place, to recite the same poems, play the same games, offer the same smile. The machinery kept turning, indifferent to what it consumed. But the courtesans remembered each other. They remembered the girl who had bound her stomach so tightly she fainted during a performance. They remembered the one who whispered to the baby she couldn't keep, just once, before leaving it beneath the shrine's stone steps. They remembered the one who tried to run, got caught, and never returned. Their stories passed through the brothel like smoke. Faint, elusive, impossible to grasp, but impossible to forget. And though no one dared to speak too openly, these stories became part of the unwritten education every courtesan received. Not just how to hold a shamisen or fold a kimono, but how to survive. It wasn't all about beauty. It never was. It was about mastering a delicate balance, being desirable without being too accessible, being enchanting without becoming real, and above all, being careful. Careful with emotions, careful with the body, careful with time. Because every courtesan knew that time was their true enemy. Not age, not wrinkles, but time as in cycles, as in consequences, as in biology. And when time betrayed them, when their body revealed what had been kept hidden for so long, there were only two fates: fix it or vanish. This is why the remedies became so elaborate, so desperate, so brutal. They weren't just trying to end a pregnancy. They were trying to erase evidence of rebellion, because in Yoshiwara, a pregnant courtesan was a woman who had forgotten her place. She had believed, if only briefly, that she had a say in what happened to her body. And for that, she had to be corrected. But what the brothel couldn't erase was what happened inside, the change that took place after a woman lost a child, or gave one away, or bled alone behind a curtain while music played down the hall. Something shifted in her, a deepening, a quiet rupture. From that moment forward, every client who touched her touched something different. Not something broken, but something awakened. She was no longer just a fantasy. She had tasted reality, and that made her dangerous. Some hid it well, others let it show just slightly, in the way they spoke, in the way they refused to laugh quite as freely. And some didn't survive it at all, not because they died, but because they stopped being who they were required to be. Yet, even within this suffering, they found ways to remain human. They sang, they told jokes, they shared meals. They braided one another's hair, and when the youngest courtesan in the house first missed her cycle, they were the ones who helped her stay calm, who slipped her the herbs, who told her what to expect. They became a secret sisterhood in a world that wanted them isolated and compliant. They passed along knowledge not for profit, but for protection. They passed along compassion in fragments, because that was all they could spare. They weren't saints, they weren't villains, they were women surviving inside a system that profited from their silence and punished their truth. And even when they were cast out, when they disappeared into legend or ruin, their stories continued to echo. Like the sound of get-us sandals on wet cobblestone, like the hush of silk sliding against skin, like the first breath of a child no one would ever name. They were never meant to be remembered, but they are. There was one truth that lived behind every folding screen and beneath every painted smile. No one came to Yoshiwara to take responsibility. The men who visited the courtesans didn't want connection. They wanted escape. They sought beauty without burden, intimacy without consequence, affection sculpted to fit the shape of their fantasies. And so, when a courtesan found herself pregnant, the idea of turning to the child's father for support wasn't just foolish. It was dangerous. Because by the time her belly began to swell, he was almost always gone. Some men vanished the moment she hinted at her condition, slipping away under the pretense of travel or business or a sudden change of heart. Others denied everything, claiming not to know her, not to remember. "You must be mistaken," they would say, while refusing to meet her eyes. Some left money, quietly, just enough to suggest care without accepting blame. A folded note, a few gold coins passed to a servant, but most offered nothing. Not a word, not a second thought. And why would they? The courtesan was never real to them. She was a mask, a performance, a moment, not a person. Certainly not a mother. Even in those rare cases where a man might have felt something, some flicker of remorse or tenderness, the barriers were too many. Social rank, family honor, legal entanglements. Claiming the child meant acknowledging an affair with a woman society considered property. That kind of scandal could ruin a merchant, disgrace a noble, or unravel a samurai's name. And so they chose the easier path. Silence. But silence, to the courtesan, was louder than any accusation. It confirmed what she already knew, that in Yoshiwara she was alone. And still, some of them hoped. Even after bleeding for days from bitter teas, even after scalding themselves in boiling baths, even after wrapping their bellies in cloth until they couldn't breathe, they hoped that maybe the man who came every week, who held her hand, who spoke to her about cherry blossoms and poetry, might be different, that maybe he would care. But he didn't. He couldn't. The world didn't allow it. The brothel wasn't just her workplace, it was her keeper. It decided who she served, how she looked, what she owed, and how she smiled. It was her home and her prison, and it made one thing painfully clear. Don't get pregnant. Not because it was immoral, not because it was shameful, but because it was bad for business. A courtesan was expected to be endlessly available, always perfect, forever alluring. Pregnancy ruined the illusion. It introduced risk, emotion, need, and the brothel wanted none of it. The moment suspicion arose, when she walked too slowly or refused sake or simply became too careful, eyes turned sharp. Surveillance began. Friends were told to watch her. Assignments were reduced, not out of mercy, but preparation. She was being replaced before anyone said a word, and then came the punishment. Each house had its own methods. Some locked her in a room with barely enough food until she solved the problem. Others demoted her, sending her to the lowest-tier clients, the drunk, the sick, the cruel. Some simply cast her out into the street, debts unpaid, reputation destroyed. A warning dressed in shame. And if the house was especially refined, they offered a different story. She had gone to visit family. She had taken a retreat. Everyone nodded politely and pretended to believe it. But they all knew. Because in a district built on illusion, truth was not just inconvenient. It was fatal. What the brothel feared most was not disobedience, it was exposure. A pregnant courtesan reminded clients that their actions had consequences, that desire could create life, that beneath the powder and perfume was a woman with blood, with pain, with a future that extended beyond the hour they had purchased. And so she was silenced, not with violence, though that happened too, but with absence. Her name erased from the roster, her memory allowed to fade. No questions asked, no stories told, except by the ones who remained. The other women watched. They learned, and they understood that in this world, to bear life was to risk losing your own. There always came a point when the choice narrowed to two impossible paths: confess or disappear. And for some courtesans, the decision was clear. They couldn't bear the consequences, couldn't endure the shame, couldn't risk being locked away, demoted or discarded like a broken instrument. So they ran. The brothel called them nijijoro, runaway courtesans, not simply fugitives, but failures. Women who had broken the contract, the illusion, the unspoken code. The courtesan didn't belong to herself. She belonged to the house, to the debts she carried, to the clients she pleased. To run was to reclaim something forbidden: agency. And so many chose to flee in silence when the moon was highest and the brothel's corridors were hushed. They dressed not in silk, but in plain robes, their elaborate hairstyles taken down, pins and combs abandoned like relics of another self. They no longer wore the face the district knew. They became anonymous, faceless, free, if only for a night. They slipped through alleyways, hid inside baskets, lay flat in the back of rice carts. Some bribed stable boys. Some climbed walls. Some walked barefoot for miles under cover of dark, trusting that no one would recognize a courtesan without her paint. There are stories, half rumor, half gospel, of girls hiding inside barrels, smuggling themselves out with the trash, of women clutching their swollen bellies, running past the gates, past the guards, past everything they had ever known, for the small, wild hope of something beyond. But where could they go? Yoshiwara was a world apart. Outside its walls, there were no paths carved out for former courtesans. Many sought out distant relatives, cousins on farms, grandmothers in shrines, anyone who might offer a corner to sleep in. Others vanished into rural towns, becoming washerwomen, beggars, fortune-tellers. There were whispers of one who became a nun, living in the mountains, raising a child with no name, reading palms for travelers, and offering silence in exchange for coins. These stories were passed down with a strange reverence, not because the women had escaped cleanly, but because they had dared to try. Not all runners made it. The brothels hired men to retrieve them, trackers who knew the streets, who knew how to question, who knew that dragging a woman back by her hair was not only permitted, but expected. If caught, the punishment was public. A spectacle designed to make an example of her. She would be paraded through the district, shamed, beaten, reinstated at the bottom of the hierarchy, or cast out entirely. Her failure was made visible to remind the others what happened when you confused performance for power. And yet, despite the danger, the courtesans still ran. Not out of rebellion, not for vengeance, but for the smallest, most dangerous luxury of all: hope. The hope that there might be a world beyond the brothel. A life where their bodies weren't bartered, where their choices mattered. A place where they could be more than a costume. A place where a child might be allowed to live. They didn't run toward glory. They ran toward quiet. And quiet in Yoshiwara was the rarest treasure of all. But not every woman could run. Not every courtesan had the coin to bribe a guard, or the strength to climb a wall, or the courage to gamble with her life on the chance that the world outside would treat her more kindly than the one within. And for those who stayed, those who could neither escape nor erase the life growing inside them, there was only one path left: birth. Not in the way most imagine it. There were no midwives in white, No clean sheets, no tender voices urging strength and bravery. In Yoshiwara, giving birth meant vanishing behind a paper door and praying that no one heard the sounds. The performance couldn't stop, so the pain had to be quiet. The miracle had to be invisible. Sometimes, if she was lucky, another woman helped. A former courtesan, a servant girl, someone who understood the stakes and asked no questions. They would prepare in silence, boil water, gather rags, line the floor with cloth that could be burned afterward. They would bring nothing personal, leave nothing behind, because if anyone found out, the price was ruin. The birth itself happened wherever it had to. A cramped storage room, a back hallway, behind a screen in a disused corner of the house, sometimes even outdoors, under the cloak of night, behind the bathhouse or near the gardens, with only the wind and the earth to bear witness. The woman would bite a towel to keep from screaming. She would sweat through silk. She would cry, but silently. And when the child finally came into the world, the first sound was not a celebratory wail. It was muffled, sometimes silenced immediately, because even a baby's first cry was dangerous. There were no birth announcements, no names chosen with care, no lullabies. The infant was wrapped in cloth, hidden quickly. If it survived the night, it was a miracle. But everyone knew it couldn't stay. Some mothers kept their children hidden for a few days, fed them in secret, rocked them gently when no one was listening. They carved out tiny spaces for love in a world that made no room for it. But it was only ever temporary. The brothel would find out, or the cries would grow louder, or the mother herself would grow too weak. And then came the hardest moment of all. She would rise in the middle of the night, child in her arms, and walk to the edge of the city, to one of the shrines tucked away in forgotten corners, stone steps leading to a place where society's unwanted were quietly left behind. These were not temples of mercy. They were altars to abandonment. She would lay the child down, sometimes with a scrap of fabric marked with a name, or a prayer written on a slip of paper, sometimes with nothing at all, just the warmth of her hands lingering a moment too long. She would not look back. She couldn't. Then she would return to the brothel, scrub the evidence from her body, paint her face, arrange her hair, and take her place in the lineup again. As though nothing had happened, as though she had not just said goodbye to a part of her that would never return. Because in Yoshiwara, love was not forbidden. It was punished. She didn't speak of it. None of them did. But every woman in the brothel knew what it meant to walk through the parlor again, freshly painted and powdered, with the ghost of childbirth still clinging to her body. The effort it took to smile while her insides ached. The stillness required to not wince when a client's hand strayed too low. The silence that wrapped itself around her like a second skin, one she couldn't shed even in the dark. She had given birth in secret, and now she was expected to forget. But forgetting was impossible, especially when the thing she had lost, her child, wasn't buried. Not truly. It lived in her memory, in her dreams, in the ache that wouldn't go away, no matter how many fans she fluttered or cups of sack she poured. Sometimes she thought she heard a cry in the middle of the night. Sometimes she thought she felt the warmth of tiny fingers curl around her own, only to wake and find her hand empty. There was no room for grief in Yoshiwara, no place to say, "I had a child." No words for what had been taken from her, not by violence, but by the machinery of a world that demanded she always be ready, always be flawless, always be someone else's fantasy. Motherhood didn't fit into that story. So it was erased, but not from her. And when she couldn't bear it anymore, she walked to the shrine, not the one she had left the child at, but another, a smaller one, a quieter one. She brought a single offering, a toy, a flower, a scrap of cloth. Something red, something soft, something that once might have belonged to the baby she never got to name. And she lit incense. Not because she believed it would change anything, but because it was the only thing she could do. She whispered an apology, or maybe a prayer, or maybe both. She didn't cry. Not there. But the tightness in her chest loosened just a little. The weight didn't lift, but she could carry it again. For another night. For another client. For another day of pretending she had never been anything more than a courtesan. And around her, the other women did the same. They each carried their own stories, hidden behind silk and powder. They performed, they laughed, they seduced. But in quiet corners, they mourned. Not just for the children they had lost, but for the versions of themselves they never got to become. In another life, perhaps, they would have been mothers in truth, with names, with homes, with children who clung to them without shame. In another life, they might have been allowed to keep what their bodies created. But this life was not that kind. This was Yoshiwara, and in Yoshiwara you could give life, but you could never keep it. They say Yoshiwara was always full of light, lanterns glowing through misty evenings, laughter echoing like music down the narrow streets, colors bright enough to burn through the night. But even in the brightest corners of that world, something darker pulsed just beneath the surface. A kind of stillness, a hush that wrapped itself around certain subjects and refused to let go. Pregnancy was one of those subjects. It was the district's open secret, both omnipresent and unspoken. Everyone knew it happened. Everyone pretended it didn't. The courtesans lived with this contradiction like a second heartbeat. They endured it because there was no other choice, and somehow they still moved with elegance. Still laughed on command. Still performed through pain that would break most people in half. Because that was the expectation, not just survival, but beauty in the act of survival, to be perfect even when unraveling. To hold a fan in one hand and a broken body in the other, and never let the two meet. That was the role, and they played it to the end. But behind the performance, there were moments of clarity late at night, after the clients had left, after the makeup had been wiped away, after the lights were dimmed and the paper doors slid shut. That was when the weight of what they carried could no longer be ignored. Not just grief, not just memory, but rage. Quiet, slow-burning rage. Not loud or violent, but heavy. The kind that settles in the chest and never leaves. Because they knew the system would never change, that their bodies would always be someone else's business, that their dreams would always come second to the fantasies of others. They knew what it meant to lose a child, to lose a piece of themselves, and then be asked to smile about it, to carry shame for something that wasn't shameful, to disappear quietly so the illusion could remain intact. But still, they endured, not out of obedience, not out of weakness, but out of a kind of defiant strength that few ever recognized. They protected each other when they could, warned the younger girls, shared what knowledge they had. A remedy, a hiding place, a story too dangerous to speak aloud but too important to forget. These weren't grand rebellions. They were small, deliberate acts of resistance. And in Yoshiwara, that was more dangerous than any sword. They weren't warriors in the way history remembers them. No armor, no banners. But they fought nonetheless. Every time they chose to survive, every time they chose to remember, every time they whispered a prayer over a red bib at a shrine, they were fighting for themselves, for the ones who didn't make it, for the children who were lost, for the truth buried beneath layers of silk and silence. History has tried to forget them, to paint them only in beauty, in longing, in the haze of lantern light. But they were more than that. They were human, flawed, afraid, resilient. They deserved to be remembered not as fantasies, not as figures of allure, but as women who bore impossible pain with impossible grace. And they still matter, not just in legend, but in the silence they carried, in the truths they whispered, in the lives they lived, and the lives they weren't allowed to keep. They were artists, yes, but they were also warriors. Their battlefield was invisible, their wounds hidden beneath painted faces, their victories measured not in glory, but in survival. And for those who carried the unbearable, who had given life in secret, or surrendered it in silence, or returned to the brothel with nothing but a flattened belly and a heart full of echoes, the act of simply standing was an act of defiance. Most of their names are lost. No ledgers recorded them, no poems sang their stories. They weren't meant to be remembered. The courtesan was a temporary flame, to be admired, consumed, then snuffed out quietly when no longer convenient. Especially the ones who got pregnant. Especially the ones who broke the rules not through rebellion, but through biology. They were brushed aside, like stray strands of hair swept from a dressing table, like ashes from a burned letter. But they mattered. They were daughters, many sold before they even understood what they were being sold into. Some believed the promises whispered into their ears by brokers, of luxury, of training, of a future that looked better than the poverty they came from. They did not know that this training would mean surrendering their childhoods, their freedom, their ability to say no. They were shaped into something beautiful, desirable, profitable. But that shaping came at a cost. When they were young, they were praised for obedience. When they matured, they were prized for allure. But the moment they showed signs of independence, whether in love, in grief, or in pregnancy, they became problems to be managed, discarded, forgotten. Yet despite all that, they endured. Not because they were allowed to, but because they refused to disappear completely. They whispered to each other in the dark. They shared the hidden remedies, the coded warnings, the prayers no one dared speak aloud. They comforted the new girls when no one else would. They carried stories of others who had run, or stayed, or died, or lived, and in that sharing, they kept each other human, not fragile like people thought, not helpless, not ornaments. They were strong in the way that only those forced to bend without breaking can be strong. And they did it in silence. Because silence was safer than truth. But if you looked closely, if you really looked, you could see it. In the slight narrowing of the eyes. In the pause before a laugh. In the careful way she set down the teacup, as if her hands remembered holding something else. Something smaller, more fragile, once upon a time. Their strength was disguised as elegance. Their grief wrapped in silk, their resistance painted in rouge. But make no mistake, it was strength.